Somewhere in the landlocked interior of China, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest ocean, there is a beach, real sand, real waves, a horizon that glows orange at sunset and fades to a starlit sky every single night, on schedule, regardless of the actual weather outside. People bring their kids here. People propose marriage here. People who have never once seen the real sea in their lives come here to feel like they have. This beach is indoors. It sits on the ground floor of a single building. And that building is not just large. By the metric most engineers and architects actually use to measure these things, total floor area, the combined square footage of every level stacked inside, it is the largest building on the planet Earth. Not the tallest, not the heaviest, the largest, full stop, by interior floor space, beating out airport terminals, container ports, and aircraft factories the size of small towns. This is the New Century Global Center in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province. And once you understand what's actually packed inside it, you'll understand why China didn't just build a big building. It built an argument about what a building is even allowed to be. Let's get the scale right first, because the actual numbers here are almost impossible to picture without a reference point. The building covers roughly 176 million square meters of total floor area, somewhere around 18. 9 million square feet, depending on which source's measurement methodology you trust. And trust me, even the engineers argue about the exact decimal, to put that in terms that actually mean something. That's enough interior space to fit 20 Sydney opera houses inside it. It's enough space for 3 Pentagons. It's enough space for 4 Vatican cities. The building's footprint alone runs 500 meters long by 400 meters wide, and it stands about 100 meters tall. Not skyscraper tall, but wide enough and deep enough that the comparison to a skyscraper completely misses the point. This isn't a tower reaching up. This is a small city laid out sideways, all of it under one continuous roof. And before you ask, yes, there are other contenders for world's largest, depending on exactly what you're measuring. Russia's Avtovaz car factory in Tolyatti has a bigger footprint, the actual ground it covers, because it's mostly a single sprawling story. Boeing's wide-body assembly plant in Everett, Washington has more interior volume, because its ceilings are tall enough to build a 747 fuselage, standing on end. But neither of those buildings is doing what the New Century Global Center is doing, because neither of those buildings is trying to be a city. By floor area, the metric that actually matters when you're comparing a multi-level, multi-use complex rather than a single-story shed, this building in Chengdu sits at the very top of the list and has held that position since the year it opened. If a single building holding that record sounds like a strange thing for a city most people outside China have never heard of, stick around, because the reason Chengdu built this thing is just as interesting as the building itself. And if stories about engineering at this scale are your thing, hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more of this kind of build hiding in places nobody's looking. So why does a landlocked city in southwestern China have an indoor beach the size of several football fields? To understand that, you have to understand what Chengdu actually is, and more importantly, what Chengdu desperately wanted to become. Chengdu is the capital of Sichuan province, home to roughly 20 million people, famous around the world mostly for 2 things: spectacular, fiery hot pot, and giant pandas. It is China's 7th largest city by population. And for most of the 20th century, it sat comfortably in the shadow of China's coastal giants, Shanghai with its financial dominance, Beijing with its political weight, Guangzhou with its manufacturing muscle. Chengdu had culture. Chengdu had history. What Chengdu didn't have, going into the 2000s, was global name recognition to match its size. China's economic planners in the 2000s and 2010s were pursuing something they called the Go West strategy, a deliberate push to develop the country's inland provinces, not just its booming coastline, and to build cities in the interior that could compete on the world stage, rather than simply feed labor and resources to the coast. Chengdu was positioned as one of the flagship cities of that push, the western anchor of a new, globalized China. And a strategy like that needs something concrete to point to. It needs a building, a skyline, a single unmistakable symbol that says, this city has arrived, and the rest of the world should be paying attention now. That is the actual origin point of the New Century Global Center. It wasn't built because Chengdu desperately needed more retail space, although it got an enormous amount of that. It was built because a regional government and a private developer made a calculated bet that the fastest way to put a landlocked, panda-famous provincial capital onto the global map was to build something so large, so strange, and so undeniably record-setting that it would generate headlines purely by existing. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a genuinely unusual way to think about urban development. Most cities that want global recognition try to attract it the slow way, through finance sectors, through universities, through gradually accumulated cultural cachet built up over generations. Chengdu's planners essentially skipped that cue. They looked at the fact that world's tallest building headlines get written about Dubai and Kuala Lumpur and Shanghai roughly once a decade, and they realized there was an entirely different record sitting unclaimed. Not height, but floor area. Nobody was racing for that title in the same way, which meant it was winnable and winnable quickly, with the right financing and the right developer willing to build something this audacious in a single, uninterrupted push. It is, in effect, a city deciding to compete in a category with less competition rather than fighting for attention, in the category everyone already knows to watch. The project was developed by Deng Hong, a Chengdu-based billionaire, through his entertainment and travel group. Construction broke ground in 2010, and in a detail that should sound familiar if you've ever watched anything else come out of Chinese construction in the last 15 years, the entire complex was substantially built and open to the public by 2013, 3 years, for a structure with more usable floor space than 20 opera houses combined. The original design firm behind the building's flowing, undulating roofline was the Paris-based engineering group ADP, the same firm with deep experience designing massive, complex public infrastructure like international airport terminals, which, when you think about it, makes a strange kind of sense because what this building actually resembles, structurally, is less a mall and more an airport terminal that swallowed a small city whole. The roofline itself is meant to evoke the flight path of a seagull skimming over open water, a deliberate aquatic symbol for a city that sits more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline. That detail is not incidental. It's the entire emotional thesis of the building, stated in architecture before you've even walked through the front door. Chengdu does not have the sea, so Chengdu decided to build one. Now let's go inside, because the one of everything, which is the building's actual marketing slogan, translated from the original Chinese, turns out to be a remarkably accurate description rather than the empty boast it sounds like. Roughly 400,000 square meters of the complex is devoted purely to retail. The New Century Shopping Mall, a single contiguous shopping floor larger than many entire downtown districts, stocked with the full range from Gucci and Louis Vuitton at the top end, down through Zara, H&M, and Uniqlo at the everyday end, plus an entire layer of specialty stores selling electronics, books, and home goods that you'd otherwise need to drive across the city to visit one at a time. Beyond the retail floor sits roughly 720,000 square meters of office and business space, the Central Business City Wing, built specifically to give Chengdu the kind of Class A commercial office stock that, until this building existed, it simply didn't have at this scale. There's a full university complex woven into the structure. There are conference and exhibition halls large enough to host Fortune 500 level corporate gatherings, which is, in fact, exactly what this building was originally supposed to do in March of 2013. Host the Global Fortune 500 conference before a corruption scandal involving the project's own developer forced organizers to quietly relocate the event to a hotel across town. Even the building's own origin story has a plot twist in it. There's an intercontinental hotel complex with more than 1,000 rooms, spread across multiple 8-story blocks wrapped around the building's edges. There's a 15-screen IMAX cinema complex. There's a full Olympic-size ice skating rink, running year-round in a city where the average winter temperature rarely drops anywhere near freezing. There's a recreation of a Mediterranean-style commercial village built indoors, complete with fake church facades and faux European street architecture, because apparently one simulated environment per building wasn't ambitious enough. And then, at the absolute center of the entire complex, sits the feature that gives this video its name, Paradise Island Water Park, and inside it, the beach. The beach itself covers roughly 5,000 square meters of imported, climate-controlled artificial sand, about the size of a football field. The ocean in front of it is a wave pool engineered to produce rolling artificial surf on a programmed schedule, strong enough for actual body surfing. Behind all of it sits a screen 150 meters long and 40 meters tall, large enough to swallow your entire field of vision if you're standing on the sand looking up, programmed to display a rotating cycle of sunrises, midday skies, and sunsets on a loop, regardless of what the actual sky outside the building happens to be doing that day. At night, a stage extends out over the pool and hosts live concerts, with the audience standing on real imported sand under a fake sky in the middle of a province better known for mountains and pandas than for any ocean horizon whatsoever. The water park complex stays at a constant year-round temperature, which means this is functionally an indoor tropical resort that operates identically in the freezing fog of a Sichuan January and the soaking heat of a Sichuan August. Outside the building's walls, the weather genuinely does not matter anymore. That single fact, that this building has functionally canceled the local climate for the people inside it, is, more than any single statistic about square meters, the thing that actually explains why millions of people choose to visit every single year. Here's the detail that gets misreported constantly, and it's worth setting straight, because if you've read anything else about this building online, there's a real chance you've already absorbed the wrong version of this story. A huge number of articles and travel blogs will tell you that this building was designed by the legendary architect Zaha Hadid. It wasn't. That confusion almost certainly comes from the fact that Zaha Hadid's firm did design a separate, genuinely striking building nearby, the Chengdu Contemporary Arts Center, which was planned to eventually sit facing the Global Center across a public plaza. The two buildings are neighbors, not siblings. One was designed by a globally celebrated architectural icon working in dramatic, sculptural concrete curves. The other was engineered by a firm best known for airport logistics, built explicitly to maximize usable commercial floor space rather than to win design awards. Conflating the two says something interesting all by itself. It tells you how much of this building's identity is built on sheer scale and spectacle rather than architectural pedigree, and how easily that scale gets mistaken for high design in the retelling. And once you understand it that way, the actual achievement here gets clearer rather than murkier. This building isn't trying to be beautiful in the way the Burj Khalifa or the Sydney Opera House are trying to be beautiful. It is trying to be undeniable. It's not competing on elegance. It's competing on volume, on comprehensiveness, on the sheer impossibility of walking through the entire thing in a single day without your feet giving out first. That is a different kind of ambition than building the world's tallest tower. It is, in its own way, a more democratic one. Height records get set by billionaires building monuments to themselves. A floor area record gets set by cramming in enough retail, hospitality, and leisure space that ordinary people from across an entire province have somewhere new to spend an entire weekend. But there's a harder question sitting underneath all of this scale, and it's worth asking directly instead of just marveling at the numbers, because the story of this building is not a clean success story from beginning to end. The exact construction cost of the New Century Global Center has never been officially disclosed by Chinese authorities, but independent estimates put the figure somewhere between $8 and $10 billion, a staggering sum for a single building project, even one this large. And the man who spearheaded it, developer Deng Hong, was arrested on corruption charges before the building's grand opening ceremony ever took place, forcing the relocation of that planned Fortune 500 conference at the 11th hour, specifically, reports at the time suggested, to avoid the political embarrassment of hosting a major international business summit inside a building whose own developer was facing criminal charges. That detail rarely makes it into the glowing travel blog write-ups, but it's a real part of this building's history, and it matters, because it's a reminder that record-setting construction projects in China, like record-setting construction projects anywhere else in the world, don't exist in some pure, abstracted realm of engineering triumph. They get built by real companies, financed through real deals, sometimes clean and sometimes not. The building that results carries that history, whether the marketing materials mention it or not. There's also a quieter question worth sitting with. What does it actually mean, culturally, to build an artificial beach for a population that may never get the chance to see a real one? Sichuan is roughly 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline in any direction. For millions of people in this province, a real ocean vacation means an expensive flight, a multi-day trip, savings spent on something that, for plenty of working families, simply isn't realistic most years. The Global Center's water park solves that gap by replacing the actual experience with a remarkably convincing simulation. And depending on how generous you want to be, that's either a genuinely democratic piece of urban infrastructure, putting a beach within a subway ride of 20 million people who'd otherwise never get one, or it's a slightly hollow substitute, a programmed sunset on a screen standing in for the real, unpredictable one nobody in the building will ever actually see from this exact spot. Probably it's honestly both at once. And the people walking onto that sand on a Tuesday afternoon get to decide for themselves which version of that story they're living. And what nobody disputes, though, is the speed at which this thing actually got built. And that speed says something real about how China approaches projects like this compared to almost anywhere else on Earth. Groundbreaking in 2010, public opening in 2013, 3 years to deliver close to 2 million square meters of finished, functioning, multi-use floor space, retail, hospitality, office, recreation, and an entire artificial coastline, all running simultaneously, all under one roof. For comparison, plenty of single skyscrapers in other parts of the world take longer than that, just to clear permitting and environmental review before a single foundation pile goes into the ground. That gap in pace is not an accident, and it's not really about this one building specifically. It's a pattern that shows up again and again across Chinese infrastructure of every kind, from high-speed rail to ports to power plants. Decide fast, finance fast, build fast, worry about the controversies if they come after the ribbon's already been cut. And the New Century Global Center turns out not to be an isolated curiosity either. It's the largest entry in a much wider pattern of Chinese megadevelopments built specifically to manufacture leisure environments that the local geography can't provide naturally. Long before this building broke ground, Germany's Tropical Islands Resort had already converted a retired airship hangar outside Berlin into an indoor rainforest, complete with its own artificial beach and a humidity level cranked up to match the actual tropics. Proof that the basic concept wasn't a Chinese invention. But what China has done since is take that same idea and apply it at a completely different order of magnitude, and repeatedly. Cities across the country, from Wuhan to Guangzhou to Harbin in the deep freeze of the Northeast, have built their own indoor water parks, ski domes, and climate-controlled leisure complexes, each one chasing the same basic premise. If the local environment can't naturally provide a certain kind of escape, build the environment from scratch indoors, at a scale that makes the substitute feel like the real thing rather than a cheap imitation of it. Harbin's indoor ski and snow facilities let residents of a city already famous for brutal winters ski in climate-controlled comfort, regardless of the actual temperature outside. Guangzhou and Shenzhen have built their own oversized indoor water parks, chasing tourist dollars in the heart of the Pearl River Delta. The New Century Global Center didn't invent this category. It simply built the biggest, most comprehensive version of it that exists anywhere on the planet, and wrapped an entire functioning city economy around it in the process. Today, more than a decade after it opened, the New Century Global Center is no longer a novelty. It's simply part of how Chengdu functions day to day. It connects directly into Line 1 of the Chengdu Metro, meaning getting from a normal city commute into an indoor beach takes exactly the same effort as transferring between any two ordinary subway stops. Families use it as a rainy day escape and a summer heat refuge in roughly equal measure, since Sichuan's summers run brutally hot and its winters run damp and gray. And this building solves for both extremes at once by simply removing the outside world from the equation entirely. Tourists from across China and increasingly from abroad treat it as a genuine bucket list stop, right alongside the giant pandas and the ancient tea houses the city is more traditionally known for. And the surrounding Tianfu New area, the planned district built up specifically around this complex, has matured into a legitimate business and innovation hub in its own right. Meaning, whatever you think of the building itself, the underlying civic bet that a single audacious structure could help drag an entire district into global relevance has at least partially paid off on its own terms. The economics behind keeping a building this size running also tell their own quiet story. A complex with close to 2 million square meters of climate-controlled floor space, a year-round artificial ocean held at constant temperature, and a 15-screen cinema running daily doesn't sustain itself on novelty value alone. It survives because the retail and hospitality revenue flowing through it every single day is large enough to cover an electricity and maintenance bill that would bankrupt a far smaller operation almost immediately. International luxury brands sign long-term leases here, specifically because Chengdu's growing middle class gave them a customer base large enough to justify the rent on a floor this enormous. The Intercontinental Wing fills rooms largely on the strength of the water park alone, a level of demand most standalone hotels in the region simply can't generate on their own. None of that scale was guaranteed to work when ground first broke in 2010. The fact that it still does, more than a decade and one global pandemic later, is itself a kind of quiet vindication of the original bet. Proof that you can build a destination this strange and this enormous, and people will keep showing up to fill it year after year, regardless of what's happening to the economy or the climate just outside its walls. So here's where this actually leaves us. More than 10 years after the doors first opened, and roughly a decade since the engineers who built it last had to justify the price tag to anyone outside the company books. The New Century Global Center remains, by floor area, the largest single building on the planet, a record it has now held for over a decade against every serious challenger, including airport terminals and industrial assembly plants several times its height. It holds that record while functioning as, more or less, a fully operational small city. A mall, a hotel district, a university, a conference venue, an ice rink, and an indoor ocean, all stacked under one continuous roof, all running every single day, regardless of season, regardless of weather, regardless of the geography, sitting just outside its walls. It was financed under terms nobody outside the deal ever fully disclosed, championed by a developer who was arrested before he got to see the ribbon cut, and built in roughly the time it takes most countries to finish arguing about the environmental review for something a tenth the size. And it raises a genuinely open question that goes well beyond Chengdu, one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. When a country can manufacture its own coastline indoors, on schedule, at a scale that swallows 20 opera houses whole, what does that tell you about the actual limits of what can be built when the will and the financing both show up at the same time in the same place? If you want to dig into more of these structures, the ones built not just to function, but to make a statement purely by existing, the subscribe button is right there, because this is far from the strangest or the largest thing currently rising out of the ground in China right now. And here's the question I genuinely want your take on, because I don't think there's an obvious right answer. A building like this gives 20 million people in a landlocked province something that used to be out of reach for most of them. A beach, a resort, an entire ocean-themed escape, a subway ride away rather than a multi-day trip away. Is that a genuine act of urban generosity, infrastructure built for ordinary people rather than for elites? Or is replacing a real experience with a flawless, programmed simulation of its own kind of quiet loss, even if almost nobody walking onto that sand on a Tuesday afternoon would ever describe it that way? Tell me where you land in the comments, because the people who've actually walked through this building are the ones whose opinion on this I actually want to hear. And if you want to see what other records China is quietly setting in concrete and steel right now, make sure you're subscribed, because we are only getting started.